G'day guys, Mac with the Outer Circle. For a little while now, I've been deliberating with myself, with my friends, and I've been putting out videos talking about how Forge World just doesn't seem to have the passion they used to for their product ranges, especially for the Horus Heresy. I've been trying to track the releases and see where the momentum may lead, but I just keep coming up with nothing tangible. This rabbit hole has led me to the following conclusion. Like a tired marriage, the passion really is gone, and all that's left is duty. I decided to pore through the footage available from Forge World themselves, thanks to their little used visual feed. Once upon a time, the staff would actually answer questions on the spot and tell us the genesis of their ideas. Unlike today, where the puppets at the company spout the marketing-approved spiels on their live streams on Twitch, ignoring the hard questions. Originally, as I understand it, Forge World projects were based on their imagination, on wanting to update old, out-of-production vehicles such as the Rhino and the Land Raider to being in line with the newer versions of those vehicles put out by Game.
Rogue Trader, the original Warhammer 40,000 book. And inside there, if you've got one of these rare tomes, you will find on page 110 and 11 the original Land Raider model. This was a scratch-built model which was made by Dave Andrews, one of the Citadel designers, and was used to make the original as a design we call the Proteus Land Raider. Now, to do this, we asked Forge World designer Phil Stachinskas to put together a new kit for Forge World which represented a lot of the design aesthetics of the original Land Raider, but in a style and size that matched some of our Land Raiders that we have as plastic kit. And this is our new kit, the new Land Raider Proteus, and you can see we've actually from the original mock-up we went back to the original designs of where the las cannon sat. And actually it's fairly faithful in many respects to the layout and the aesthetics of the original kit. But it's a slightly longer kit, it's slightly lower, and actually looks more fitting with a 40k army nowadays.
Alan himself would take a concept and do copious amounts of research, including getting pictures, creating a theme for his work, and then convincing others within the company to follow his vision. If we look at this clip from Bad Ab War's Q&A, you gain some insight.
Yeah, I mean, one of the great advantages with this one, and it's, to be honest, from my perspective as a Forge World writer, is exactly what I want to happen is, I have a rough idea, I decide kind of what it is, we talk to other people in Forge World, sort of canvas opinion. Yeah. It's at the start of Bad Ab as well, we had a big meeting with lots of people in a room, and I got to explain what I thought was going on, and shout things like Babylon and Mesopotamia, you know, with the eagles and the lions, and people look at me funny.
Yeah, very funny.
and then I drag pictures off the internet and go, no, like this. And that ends up in the hands of Sam,
yeah,
who then works his genius and turns out what I think is a fantastic miniature that is infinitely better than I imagined. So that's kind of, if you like, the perfect thing we're after with Forge World is we have a good idea for a model, and then the model is better than the idea. I mean, we do also make, you know, good models, and then we clad ideas on them, but and it works both ways. But
it did work very well for this particular project.
You'd like to know, is there anything in particular that inspired you? Anything from the sort of Mesopotamian influences, things like that?
Oh, this is where I get to sound like a crazy man again. When I was doing the Astral Claws, I sat down thinking about what they were, and if you wanted them in a nutshell, obviously they and Huron himself are indivisible in some ways in terms of story and plot. I wanted them as sort of an empire, sort of pocket empire of pride and martial power that eventually becomes an empire of paranoia and madness, and then of course falls in destruction. And given that the Space Marines are really slightly demigod-like in many ways, obviously they are physically superhuman, they're long-lived, they are lords of battle. They're not just very good soldiers, they're different things, and they're mythical things. They're once sort of holy warriors and knightly orders, and different Space Marine chapters, even though they might be quite similar in terms of organisation and without being fully on the tabletop when you play them, obviously we have to have governing sets of rules that helps you to play fair and balanced games. But in terms of their mindset and the characters, they can be very different and very striking. And once I started thinking about the power and the paranoia and the sort of slightly sumptuous glory of them, if I can put it like that, I started thinking about classical and pre-classical influences. So you know, sort of the lion's head and sort of the lapis blue, which is very sort of Babylon and Near East, and almost seeing Huron himself as almost as the king, almost a god king to the poor humans that he eventually ends up ruling. And of course then you end up with, if you like, a slightly metaphorical war of the gods between the different space marines. So I kind of try to set that epic stage with them. I think that was one of the things that we...
After listening to you then, you can understand why we end up with figures like we end up, because the way Al's brain works is it's just great.
I'm glad you think so. But yeah, but obviously, as well, you've got to try and be distinct and striking with them. And once we got over the initial hurdles of deciding exactly who and what the astral claws were, things get easier, because if you've made a very strong image and feel for them, the rest of it gets a lot easier.
It does, that's right. If you've got a strong direction in which to go, you can then...
And I had to, as it were, do it many times for the different chapters inside what became the 2 books, which is incidentally my fault, in that it was meant to be 1 book. So I do apologise to anybody that was, really didn't want 2 Space Marine books in a row. It was me, I wrote too much. So feel free to castigate me at an event that I appear in for the company.
What's fascinating is how much humble passion Alan seemed to have. Even the way he spoke about what he makes, or if given the opportunity. Perhaps the genesis of the Mechanicum and the Horus Heresy lies within his words here.
Are there any other stories you'd like to base books around, and if so, what would they be?
Well, to sort of answer the first bit, which is it a bit different? Yes, it is, because it really is the first one we've sort of delved into the history, which is been great fun to do, as I think I mentioned earlier. And it's different because it gives us a small creative framework to base what we do on, and then add a lot more detail. One of the things I think Forge World's really good for, especially in terms of writing and doing variants and models, is simply to give you a somewhat narrow but very deep slice of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. Whereas a codex has to be quite general and make quite a sort of sweeping breadth of a subject, such as the Space Marines. We can be much more specific and say these very specific Space Marines are like this in this time and this place, and the certain dark events that may happen to them, or glorious campaigns. And we can give people a lot more nuance and detail on stuff. Is there more of that I'd like to do? Yes, of course there is. There's loads of cool stuff in the Warhammer 40,000 background I'd love to expand upon, as well as making up new stuff. For me personally, and this is going to sound a bit geeky, but hopefully the audience, just a bit, but hopefully the audience will forgive me. Stuff like the Nova Terror Interregnum, the Age of Apostasy, I'd love to do stuff with. And even some very minor stuff like the Altered Campaign and other Crusade Gods. And stuff to do with what the Mechanicus get up to and that sort of thing. I'd love to have a look at historically and sort of really increase the kind of the level of detail and background on those, and hopefully people will find that also cool and exciting to do. So do write in and tell us that we should do that. That's always something good to do.
It seemed that he found it comfortable working within the broad strokes of canon, which is important to me. And rather than changing it to suit his story like Games Workshop and Forge World so often seem to do now, he would use his stories to fill in the blanks in the existing canon.
Says, do you prefer writing these sort of established events, or do you feel at all limited, like creatively, by what you can put in?
Well, I don't think so. Obviously, in a very sort of general sense, you're limited if you're dealing with a historical event that has known players. Obviously, that's then the sides, if you like, in it that you embrace. But all that really does is give you a framework to work off, which is what you end up giving yourself anyway, if you're sensible, when you're doing creative projects from the start. You've got to make, right at the beginning, certain basic choices, answer basic questions of the who, the why, the where, and the what. And when taking a historical event inside the fictional universe of Warhammer 40,000, you take that as your initial framework, rather than sort of inventing one yourself. One of the things I very much wanted to do when treating with the Bad of War was to keep if you like, the outermost layer of detail just what people expected. So the same people were involved, the Astral Claws, Huron, obviously the Red Scorpions, lots of different chapters, and it happened in the Maelstrom Zone. All as everybody knows that's been knocking around with Warhammer 40,000 with a fairly deep knowledge. But inside that, add layers of detail, also mystery and darkness and, extreme bloodshed.
But you're very good at adding darkness and mystery to it.
Yeah. Who'd have thought it? So the closer you get into the story, the more secrets may be revealed, or more things that may surprise the reader, even though they may already know the general story because they know, if you like, the historical event. The details may elude them, and it also allows me to play with certain great things about Warhammer 40,000 anyway, which is the sense of mystery and often slightly irrational nature of it, and also the idea that history itself may be a lie, and the Imperium doesn't even know the truth of what goes on inside its borders, or certainly has a tendency to mythologise stuff. So I got to go, well, actually, is it the Battle War you thought it was, or did stranger and darker things take place than you knew? So that's been great.
The way he speaks about campaign design, balance, and what people want, to me, is some of the most interesting stuff to hear, and how he went about personally designing campaigns. He would think about what the customer's needs were, what needed to be achieved by the overall goal of the campaign, but also tying that into what was actually tangible on the tabletop and how it would play out.
When writing scenarios such as those in the campaign for Bad Ab War, do you try and make them even for both sides, or do you weight them in favour of the historical outcome?
Well, a slightly disingenuous answer is both, more or less. Just to sort of backtrack there for a second, when coming to a book like Bad Ab, or any Imperial Armour project of that size in general, you've got to ask yourself a certain set of questions when you're starting, and some of that's to do with games design as well as it is with the story. And very much from the start of Bad Ab War, some of the questions I asked myself was, if I were the man just buying this in a shop, what would I want from this book? And as well as, hopefully a good and interesting story. Other things like, I would like to know quite a lot of detail about the Space Marine chapters in there, because Space Marines are cool, why wouldn't you want to know? So hence you get the big Space Marine chunky articles in there. But the other thing I wanted, importantly, was the ability for people who pick up the book to play their own version of the Bad Ab campaign, but not in a restrictive way, not in a way that it's sort of the historical reenactment, but more of a way of, you can have your own fun and there's room for your own imagination and your own exciting stories inside the sort of the wider Bad Ab narrative. And that feeds right into the games design element. So there's a campaign system which is balanced, but broadly follows the historical outline of the plot, because that's what ties it together. But in that you can have all sorts of games, very specifically designed to sort of weighted on points for winning, in essence. So things stay balanced very, very. And this is a very long-winded answer, I apologise, but I'm getting there eventually. One of the things we did, for example, for the campaign was the campaign playtest, where I basically locked several of my friends in a room and refused to let them out till they did the playtesting for me, along with me going along. So everybody got to play a bit of the Bad Ab War, we'll play one of the characters and stuff, and everybody got their own character, who eventually made them into the books as well, in altered and more balanced forms. And as part of that big playtest, I would come up with very specific scenarios and missions and setups based on the story, and some of them work better than others. And the sort of rendering those down gave me the specific missions to put into the Bad Ab War campaign. And their goal is to be fair, but not necessarily balanced, which might sound tricky, but what that means is it's fun for both sides, but they may not be equal, because at the story side of it, it's not equal. I mean, these aren't tournament games, it's not a level playing field in that sense. But both sides have to have a chance to win. So it's a balancing act. To give you an example off the top of my head, in 9, Volume 9, there's a mission called The Massacre at Bellerophon's Fall, which relates to a part of the story where the command structure of the Mantis, the Marines Errant are ambushed by the Mantis warriors. Now the scenario reflects that, and it's a bad day to be a Marines Errant. But at the same time, you don't have to wipe the enemy out as much as survive. So it's fair in that sense, where it's not a level playing field for a battle. Hopefully that makes some sense.
It's also interesting to see just how previous Imperial Armour books were marketed and how the Horus Heresy itself was marketed. The notable difference being basically how they would talk with the audience in the earlier videos, answering questions that we have at home, instead of talking to the audience, which is very much a pattern they pick up later on in their videos. And you can see Alan himself has less passion in the later videos.
It tells the story of a chaos incursion into the old world in great detail, and allows us to do a lot of stuff to the fringes of the Warhammer world, really explore it and give a deep piece of background for the Warhammer world, as well as do additional games content like a Chaos Dwarf army list, as well as scenarios and the ability to play the games that tie into the narrative of the story. The book itself is the first in an ongoing series that Forge World are doing to cover the epic sweep of the Horus Heresy and the conflict of the Space Marine legions that nearly tore the Imperium to pieces. Basically, at the dawning of the heresy, just as the War Master's dark plans are coming to fruition, he has to rid himself of all the forces within his own legions and those closest to him that would remain loyal to the Emperor. So what you have, in essence, is treachery and ambush, but it doesn't all go the War Master's way. As always, it's a lavish book. Production department and artists have done a fantastic job again. It's full colour hardback, leather bound, just everything, all the quality you expect from the Horus Heresy release.
They would also interview the sculptors about how they went about creating their works, particularly Simon Egan, Edgar Skoromowski, Phil Stachinkas, and more, and bringing to life imagery from not just pre-drawn imagery from artists, but also stuff from their own mind, which the artists would then extrapolate upon for the books.
Well, Lorga was the first Primarch project I had the chance to work on. To say it was pretty terrifying and intimidating to work on such a project, because a lot of people have expectations on those iconic characters, and Simon Egan did such a brilliant job, so I had to do justice to that. The mood of the model is a big contrast to the previous Primarchs, because it's not a battle scene. I definitely wanted to bring forward the personality of Lorga, being less a warrior than his brothers, more a man of swords and a brilliant orator, but most of all he's a classic tragic figure. He has been betrayed, and in the belief of doing the right thing, he becomes the traitor, the first heretic. So really to emphasize this, I tried to get across a sense of deep, controlled deep anger, and also a sense of a calm before the storm, so having him standing alone on top of a mountain.
We started the process of designing Ferrus when I was still working on Fulgrim. I felt the need that when I was doing Fulgrim, because of the brief, and the brief being that we were to do the battle between the Primarchs of the 10th and the 3rd Legion on Isfahan 5, that I needed to do both mock-ups at the same time. With the pose of Ferrus, I really wanted a strong grounded pose on him, a real contrast to Fulgrim's elegant, flamboyant pose. But also in the pose I wanted to get in a real sense of movement and swing in his body, to show the sort of the power and the strength he had when he's wielding Forgebreaker.
I think it's where the softer material really comes into its own, because you can work a lot of that out quickly and much more easily on the softer kind of material. So once it's got to this stage, I think all the kind of hard stuff has kind of...
Well, these shoulders, for example, they were made out of the same things as the block model is made out of, because it's not great for making models out of, because it's very porous. But if you fill it and smooth off the surface, then you can mould it. And because they're quite hollow and quite a difficult shape, it was just the easiest way to do it. Whereas a lot of other times I'll use a filler, basically like a car body filler, and a release agent, because you can create a positive shape to make a negative shape then. So
like
there's
a
lots.
mould.
Yeah, it's kind of like a mould, but yeah, it's very difficult to machine a negative. Complex shape, say like the head or whatever. It's much easier to make like the shape of the interior as a negative and then push it in. Or you can most of the materials we use you can heat up and bend as well. So there's lots of different ways of doing it. It's all just
and just masses of hours and just effort. It's
a lot of scraping with scalpels and sanding.
There's no real kind of magic tricks really. There's just there's a lot of hard work that goes into these models, and many hours. So
sadly, about 6 years ago, the visual feed dried up. Interviews stopped. The designers no longer spoke about the genesis of their works, and the passion was removed, only to be replaced by Games Workshop's own impersonal marketing team and their lackluster videos. It's interesting to me because I think it correlates perfectly to the rise in specialist games. Instead of Forge World making the products they feel like making, now they're being shoehorned into making constant new characters and releases for these specialist games which really don't have anything to do with Forge World. Forge World was created to envision the big things, giant tanks and armoured vehicles, upgrade kits, fleshing out, as they say, the narrow slice, as it were. Instead, what they've become now is Games Workshop Lite, producing constant minor releases for their minor games in order to satisfy Games Workshop's customers' demands. And that's kind of depressing to me. The slow pace of the Heresy now, the weak release schedule, it makes me think back to Alan's own words. Words I'll leave you with now.
Going forward, Forge World is going to be producing an ongoing series of books, and perhaps it's important to note that these aren't, as it were, instead of our Imperial Armour books. This is an additional strand of our product, like we have the Warhammer Forge books as well. So this is not a limited series or something that will be 2 or 3 books and then we'll be done with. We are determined to do the Horus Heresy justice and do the grand sweep of the book.